Let's learn how to paint water. The first part of any painting is a sketch, and so I want to talk a little bit about how I approach that with this. Now, obviously, the picture on the left has a ton of detail in it, and I really didn't want to paint all of that. So, what I mainly did here was simplify that sketch down into a few key elements. So I have the fisherman, I have the boats, I have the pier in the front, and his net, and the sunset, and that's about it. There might be some elements that I add in while I'm painting, but for the most part, I'm just going off this sketch. I'm also not painting something super realistic, so I'm not super worried about all the details. Alright, onto the first layer. I typically like to start with the background, and that's because as I continue to add more layers, they typically will get darker, and any mistakes or blank spots that I have in the background, I'll probably end up covering them up. So for the sunset, I'm starting in the upper right with a indigo dark blue color, and I'm fading it into an orange. Now it's kind of important that you use orange here because you don't want to use yellow necessarily or it'll blend into a green color, and you don't really want that in your sunset. You can blend yellow into orange, and that's what I do right around the sun where there's a giant highlight, but I don't typically try to blend yellow into blue. Then I'm going to leave a little bit of a white spot for where the boats are, and I'm going to move on to the reflection in the water. And this is going to be a pretty bright reflection right around where the sun is. It's going to be mostly saturated oranges, and I'm slowly going to fade that out into the rest of the water, but I'll kind of leave it white towards the bottom right, and that's for a very important reason. As the water gets closer to your point of view, so whoever is essentially holding the camera in this painting, you're going to see through that water more, and it's going to look darker. There's going to be less reflection of the sunset coming off the water. Some ways that people have described this as sort of like skipping a rock. If you threw a rock straight down into the water, it would not really skip. If you threw it at an angle, it would likely bounce along. And light kind of works the same way. When the angle's really low and the sun's way off in the distance, it's going to reflect right into your eyes. But when you look straight into the water right next to you, you're going to see right through it, and it's going to be darker and blue or even closer to a black tone. Now, that's important for us because it means that the blue that we're seeing closer to the sunset, closer to the horizon, is actually the reflection of the sky, or maybe the boats in the distance, whereas the water that's close to us is actually us looking straight down into the water. Now, onto the pier and the fishermen. I'm using a raw sienna and a burnt umber combination here to get the first layer of that pier down. There's a lot of reflection from the sun, and so I want to make sure that I capture some of that color in it. Even though it fades to a pretty dark color in the foreground, I want to really exaggerate those colors as much as I can. For those cast shadows, I actually am mixing in black directly into those burnt umber and raw sienna tones. So to say that you can't shade with black, I think is a little bit misleading and maybe just good advice for beginner artists, but as you continue to grow, black is actually a pretty useful color to use in your shading. You have to use a little bit of caution maybe, and you have to keep adding saturation to that black so it's not just pure black, but it's a great tool for making things darker. The net in that foreground is actually also catching a highlight, so make sure you leave it white because that'll really make that highlight pop as you continue adding depth. The next step here is I'm adding some highlights on the boat because they're pretty reflective. They're all made of like fiberglass, so they're all going to be reflective and you're going to see that sun bouncing off of them. So I'm adding some highlight orange spots here that I'm going to paint around as I add the shadows, but it's a nice little hint of that reflection, and it really gives this illusion of the boats, even though when we get to them, you'll see that they're not rendered in the most complex or detailed way. It's really all about making the illusion of the boats work. Now I'm going to let those highlights dry, and while I'm letting them dry, I will put a first layer of this silhouette onto the fisherman here. One thing that can be tricky about painting silhouettes is it's easy for them to end up looking flat. So if I could have changed one thing about this painting, I probably would have tried to add a little bit more depth into the form of this fisherman on the pier. I probably could have used a little bit of a rim light around him to really emphasize his structure and form. Moving on to the shadows. For the boats, I'm using a mixture of the indigo that I used to paint the sky and adding a little bit of black to it. Now the boats in the marina are pretty much always white, and they are also pretty reflective, which means the color and the tones around them are going to reflect pretty cleanly. So on the sides of the boats facing away from the sunset, they're either going to reflect the water below them or the sky above them. Now, because the sun is away from them, the sky that is reflecting is actually that indigo color. So that's what I'm using for most of the shadows on the boats. Using that same color, I'm going to start to paint some of the masts of the sailboats. And to do that, it's mainly just a really light hand holding the brush really loosely and sort of scribbling as you move up the mast, or I guess down in this case. When I paint those reflections, even though the mast in real life is a pretty straight, even line, when I paint the reflection, there's not really any even weight to any of it. It doesn't go in a straight line. Sometimes it curves way out of straight, and that's because of the shape and the motion of the water. There's also going to be areas that are a little bit darker and the areas that are a little bit lighter, and that's just based on how the waves are moving and how much of the light each little section is catching. I'm going to let most of that dry, and while it's drying, I'm going to move on to the actual farthest back background, which is these tree silhouettes. For the most part, this is again a mixture of a black and indigo. It's kind of the darkest color in the whole painting, just by the way of the sun and the contrast that you're expecting. They're just going to end up being really, really dark. But what it does with all that contrast is add a lot of interest to the contrast between the bright sunset, especially the area right next to that highlight of the sun. That contrast is really intriguing to your eye. While I paint that background, I can also add in some of the masts for the sailboats, and those again are just going to be really dark tone. One little detail you can add here is that there's a section of each mast that's going to reflect the light towards your eye. And so one little trick is to have tiny little highlights along one edge of the mast. Those are the tiny little tricks that will actually end up being really important in the finished painting. As you keep adding those shadows, you can also add a little bit more to the bottom of each boat, the part of the boat that's going to be the darkest. So right next to the water, there's going to be a pretty dark, almost black line between the boat and the water, and that's going to reflect not only on the boat, but also in the same distance onto the water. Now I'm going to add another layer onto the pier. So I'm going to start with the fisherman. I'm going to add some more depth and some more dark tones. Again, this is basically going to be flat black, just based on the silhouette coming off the sun. For the cast shadow, it's a mixture of that same black and burnt umber, but I'm going to fade it out. So it's going to be super dark right next to his feet, and as it goes back and away from him, it's going to get a little bit lighter just from other ambient lighting, making that shadow not quite as intense. For the net next to him, you just want to pay attention to the direction that the light's going. The shadow is obviously going to be on that front side of the net, and then on the outside back end of the net. Just because the sun is pointing that direction, that's how the cast shadow is going to go. And as I'm painting those shadows, I realized that I didn't love the sort of splotchy look of the trees in the background, so I just kind of filled in most of them, and I thought that was a little bit better. On the net, I wanted to add a little bit of a shadow for the actual net part, the like wire part of the net, so I used a pretty light tone just to start coloring in where that net and where those shadows would be. And I'll just refine those and add a little bit more contrast in a future layer. Now let's move on to the water ripples. This is one of the more fun parts of this painting to do. And I'm going to start from the foreground and move backwards, and that's mainly because the orange is a lighter color than the blue, and so I'm painting over the orange with the blue. I probably couldn't do the opposite. I couldn't paint the orange over top of the blue. It just wouldn't come out quite the same. So the main trick here is that you're going to try to use a lot of variation, and there's going to be a bunch of tiny different curves that are different lengths, different widths, different spacing. You don't want them to all sort of follow a uniform spacing and width and stuff, or it's going to look fake. One guiding principle that I use is that as you get further away from the ripples, they're going to get smaller and thinner and more closely spaced together. As you bring them towards the point of view, they're going to get wider, more defined, and they're going to have general shape and flow to them. And that's what really creates that illusion that as it gets further away, it's just kind of all blending together. But as you get closer, they get darker, again, because you're looking straight down into the water. and not so much reflecting from the sky, but they also get more defined. You get more of a shape of a wave and a curve rather than just sort of random ripples in the distance. One thing you can also do is add a little bit of distortion around things that are reflecting in the water, like the masts of the sailboats. See, the little curves and bends of the waves are also going to catch that reflection, so it's not just going to be a straight line, and it's not just going to be a single line. It's going to have little bounces and refractions within those waves. I had a few finishing touches that I wanted to add to this. So for starters, I thought that the pier towards the left was not quite dark enough. There wasn't enough contrast between the water and the pier. So I darkened that up a little bit. I added this fishing pole, which is basically just a black line. There is a little bit of reflection that's being caught from the sun, so I tried to add that as well. I added a little bit more detail around the net that the fisherman's using, and then I also added another layer of black shadow to the silhouette of the fisherman himself. I think he had like a little cigarette in his mouth, so I also added that in there as well. But all those tiny little touches that you can do right at the end really end up adding quite a bit to your painting. For me, these end up being areas with lots of contrast that really draw my eye and end up being some of my favorite parts of each piece that I make. Thanks for watching along. If you found this interesting, leave a comment below, subscribe, like, all the normal things, and let me know what else you want me to do in the future. See you next time.